Welcome back, everyone. Our final panel, The Role of Ideology and Social Uprisings in South Asia, for today examines the role of ideology in shaping social uprisings in the region. This session is chaired by Dr. Diego. Our speakers for the session are Dr. Ajay Godavarti, Professor Dina M. Siddiqui, Mr. Santosh Sharma Pudel. I invite Dr. Diego to begin.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning in the parts of the world where I am, and welcome to panel 3 of ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2026. We are joined by three speakers for this panel. Let me just say a couple of words on this panel for those of you who have not read the program attached. But very briefly, this panel looks at how ideologies and political discourses are driving or drove the uprisings that we have seen across much of South Asia in the last few years. Um, because, one way of seeing them is, of course, that explosions of anger against malgovernance or corruption or whatever it is, the immediate trigger that sparked off this violent uprising and revolutionary uprisings. But then, if we probably dig deeper, it is interesting to see how the people who participated in this uprising meant by system change. What does it mean to change the system? And can the system be changed without an underlying ideology or vision or political philosophy that could sustain in a longer term and also inform the structural changes like constitutional changes or institutional reforms that are needed to improve things and to change the system. So this is broadly speaking the themes we will be talking with, the three speakers. We have Dr. Ajay Gudavarti, who is Associate Professor at the Center for Political Studies at JNU, and also an Associate Member of the Institute of Humanities at Simon Fraser University in Canada. He has held various visiting positions across many parts of the world. You can find them in the bios attached to the programs. And if you follow news in India and actually internationally, you might have seen some of his columns in the Hindu, the Indian Express, the Wire, and others. Then we have Professor Dina Siddiqui, who is a professor at New York University and a cultural anthropologist by training. She has published extensively on the global garment industry and supply chains. She's an expert on Bangladesh, of course, and she has been she sits on the editorial board of Contemporary South Asia, Dialectical Anthropology, and the Journals of Bangladesh Studies. She's also in the executive committee of the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies. Thanks for joining us. And finally, we have Mr. Santosh Sharma Pudel, who is a foreign policy analyst and co-founder of the Nepal Institute for Policy Research, and is currently a faculty member of the Central Department of International Relations and Diplomacy at the Tribhuvan University in Kathmandu. So welcome all of you for joining us. And I would hand over to Dr. Ajay Gudavarti for his talk. I will give 15 minutes to each of you, and then I will gently try to interrupt you. And after one more minute, I will abruptly interrupt you so that we have time for all the three speakers and also for some questions at the end. If all of this sounds good, please, Ajay, you're welcome to start.
Okay, thank you, Diego. Thanks to ISAS and NUS Singapore for this wonderful opportunity. So my talk would, I will try and present what's happening in India during the last 10 years of the populist, I might add, authoritarian regime that India has had for the last 10 years. And there have been very interesting protests. So I will cover four such protests: the farmers' protest, the Muslims predominantly leading the anti-CAA citizenship related protests, third Gen Z protests, and fourth is actually protest by social elites. And try and raise few conceptual theoretical questions that at this juncture are instructive for us in terms of political theorization of protest politics vis-a-vis populism, that how populist under populist regimes movements are faring, and what are the questions that I think are important for us to further reflect and theorize on. So to begin with the farmers movement that took place in 2021, it was a 2-year long protest movement. About 750 farmers lost their lives. They were protesting against 3 farm laws, which we don't have time to get into the details, but broadly it was about privatizing the land. It was about MSP, the basic, minimum price, support price that the government offers to the agricultural farmers in India to buy their produce. It was about agrarian infrastructure, so on and so forth. And the loss farmers felt, the loss that the government was bringing in, the farmers felt would eventually impoverish them. So, I mean, this was a very astounding kind of a protest because it is one of the rare protests in the last 10-year phase, which did succeed in pushing the government back on the farm laws. That the government had to go back and giving the populist authoritarian posturing of this government. They never go back on many of the laws or bills or policies that they formulate. They roughshod and go ahead. But this has been one rare case where the government did step back and withdraw the laws. And the questions therefore would be that why did the farmers movement succeed unlike many other movements? One of the reasons obviously is that farmers movement began with a basic demand related to agriculture, but as the movement spread, it spread its framework and its ideological political discourse, that it went on to question the corporate model of development, then that it linked it to the freedom of speech. It went on to link it to the model of governance being presented. So the kind of political narrative that the farmers movement could generate did on the social front did succeed in generating an alternate hegemonic narrative. And I feel that's one reason why the government had to push back. So the first lesson that we really learn is that sectoral demands, sectoral movements don't work under populism. That movement seem to work when they're able to enlarge their social base, go beyond they produce narratives that can appeal at a larger macro political level. For instance, farmers generated a counter-nationalist discourse. They said that they linked farmers to the question of sovereignty. They linked their discourse. After all, nationalism and nation are linked to the question of territoriality and land. And farmers are the one tilling the land. And this kind of powerful symbolism, that after Mahatma Gandhi linked salt to sovereignty, it was the farmers who linked land to sovereignty. And therefore, I think the counter narrative that the farmers could generate, because it had the capacity to burst the dominant narratives of the government on the front of sovereignty, security, nationalism, and populism. So that's one big takeaway as to how protest politics under populist regime need to work, that those counter narratives need to have a macro reach beyond sectoral kind of a focus. But having said that, let me add a couple of other very nuanced points that really come out is that this movement took place in 2 states, in Uttar Pradesh and Haryana, in the north of India. But surprisingly, soon after the movement, movement, both these states, Bharatiya Janata Party, the current populist government and political party, the center, actually came back to power with a thumping majority. So this really, was a big question for many of us in India, that how come a movement that succeeds socially, how come a movement that succeeds at the level of political discourse and at the level of narratives fails to translate that into electoral politics. So does this mean that post-colonial societies like India have an enduring gap between the social and the political? That movements that succeed at the social plane may not necessarily succeed on the electoral front. And the question would be, what does this really tell us about protest politics? That does that mean that in the popular imagination of the citizens, or popular imagination of the electorate, does it mean that social movements that are accepted, the narratives that are accepted on the social and even on the ideological front, do not naturally translate into an electoral outcome, which means that between the social and the political, it seems to be a mediated space, that there are complex mediations that happen between the social and the political. I don't again have the time to get into those mediations, but suffice it to say that it's a heavily mediated space, and we need to, those of us interested in theorizing political movements, political subjectivity, need to get into the nuances of that mediation, that what goes on between these two spaces, how do they get structured. So I think those are the 2 or 3 questions that I would urge that we focus on, and maybe in Q&A session we can take up some more details of it. The second important movement was the anti-CA movement. It was majority targeted. This law was targeted against Muslims. By and large, the apprehension by the religious minorities in India was that it is questioning their citizenship, that many of them would get disenfranchised, they would not have a voting right. But this movement did not succeed the way the farmers' movement succeeded, right? Even though this movement did have large political mobilization, it did generate an effective political discourse, but it did not really, succeed in kind of bursting and pushing the government back, a populist government back. Why would this be so? That in spite of comparable political mobilization, large number of Muslims in lakhs hitting the streets, popular protests all over India, literally they were all over India that these protests spread. Unlike farmers' movement, which was focused on Delhi, this movement was present all over India. But this movement really did not succeed in pushing the government back in withdrawing these laws. So what does this comparison between the farmers movement and the anti-CA movement tell us? Is that the central gap being that the farmers movement was essentially social in its outlook, that it was an ideologically mounted movement, while CA movement somehow got restricted to being represented in popular discourse as a movement restricted to religious minorities. Did the anti-CA movements fail because they were projected essentially as consolidating the already existing polarized discourse between the majority Hindus and the Muslims? So this gives, I think this again leads us to a very complex set of theoretical questions that one needs to go in as to how do minorities, religious minorities, approach a situation where they already have a kind of a reified identity, that that there is already a polarized discourse. So when you have consolidated movements by religious minorities, when you see thousands and lakhs of religious minorities walking on the streets, my reading of the situation has been that it further reifies the existing polarization. So what then is really the option with religious minority related protests under populist conditions? That if they consolidate their demands, then they get further reified. When they get further reified, then it only adds to the already existing polarized narratives between the dominant Hindu majority and Hindu majoritarian politics and religious minority politics, which begins to look fairly sectarian and inward looking. So how do religious minorities face this situation? How do they, for instance, one theoretical question that comes to my mind is that, do they begin to avoid reifying their identity and begin to deconstruct their identity? Is that one way that should religious minorities then pitch their demands not in terms of reifying those demands as Muslim oriented demands, but broaden them in terms of some other political or social narrative. But the debate that went on in India was that if somebody is targeted for being a Muslim in India, then they have to really protest as a Muslim, that they cannot really avoid or circumvent this question of Muslimness. And therefore, that's only the legitimate way that religious minorities can face up to the polarized situation. But that has the obvious pitfall of presenting a very reified, consolidated, monolithic Muslim identity, which is precisely the narrative that the Bharatiya Janata Party runs in the public discourse. So you simply seem to reproduce the same majoritarian gaze when you do that. So how does religious minority politics, how do they kind of face this paradox between reification and invisibilization? That if you don't consolidate your identity, then there is the other pitfall that you get simply invisibilized, and which is also part of the majoritarian politics, that they wish to invisibilize religious minorities because there has been a sustained attack on religious Muslim symbols, public spaces, access to public spaces. So part of the majoritarian agenda. Therefore, the majoritarian populist majoritarian politics cut both ways. That it aids the majoritarian narrative if you reify your identity, it aids them if you invisibilize their identity. So this, I think, is the paradox that all religious minorities, the Christians, the Buddhists, the Muslims are facing in India right now, that they're grappling with this question, that how do they break the majoritarian grip, given the fact that whether they consolidate or whether they don't, both seem to kind of aid and consolidate the populist majoritarian narrative. So that's the question I leave for the audience to come back and think along with me, that how do you go about it. The third important movement that happened in India is the Gen Z movement. The movement of Gen Zs, the youth, students who are young students who are on streets. Very interestingly, what drew them to the streets were two issues. One was an issue of corruption. The other, more recent one, was the issue of protest against an Aravalli range. There was a hill range in India, in Delhi, where government has passed a new bill to getting into mining, and which leads to ecological destruction. So that's the broad context of, and there was spontaneous protest politics, mostly by young. It's very interesting that why the youth and the young should get onto the streets for ecological related issues. That what does that tell us about their own self-representation, that they feel this is the central issue for them to get on to. I mean, they are not interested, were not on streets when the farmers were protesting. They did not take interest in anti-CA movement. But youth, suddenly middle class youth, and this was essentially a middle class driven politics, very interestingly responded to this. But this leads us to a range of questions, because these movements had very specific social character. They were broadly leaderless movements. They did not have very specific demands apart from asking the government to withdraw mining. And the leaderless movements, these movements somehow replicated what you can find in Occupy Wall Street kind of protest politics. It's leaderless, it is dispersed, it is spontaneous and sporadic. And I must also add that these movements died out very quickly before they actually gained much. They appeared on the scene and they simply disappeared. This, I think, also tells us something about the changing social and political subjectivity on the ground, that the Gen Z are entering into movements that are very spontaneous, very sporadic, very contextual. They are leaderless. They do not have sustained organizations. These movements cannot sustain themselves for a long period of time. Like, for instance, the farmers' movement sustained for about 2 years. But these movements came and died out. They couldn't really sustain themselves. This should tell us something to investigate in terms of the new social ethics that are operating. What you said in your introductory remarks, Diogo, that these are not really ideological movements. These, when you're talking about mining, these movements don't go on to question corporate hold on mining. They don't question neoliberal model of development. They did not bring into invoke freedom of expression or liberal constitutionalism or authoritarianism. None of them, this was their concern. They were really focused only on the question of mining as if it happens in a vacuum. So, but it did draw and it did inspire the get onto the streets. So I think there is maybe should one then, but it is more in terms of these movements should not be too preachy, that they should not preach others what is right and wrong. They should avoid an ethical discourse. So I think, and the second follow-up question is the impact of social media, that collapsing attention spans do they have, because most of these movements worked on the social media platforms, widespread sharing of Instagram, WhatsApp. It's those platforms that these movements really worked. There were very few street protests that we watch. So I think these are not ideological, strictly oriented, which will be very difficult for us to place anywhere in the ideological spectrum. But it did carry a deeply personal. The Gen Z responded by saying that we are here because we see the consequences of mining. We see the consequence of a climate change, pollution, so on and so forth. Should they present to the absence of questions related to political economy? My last 2 minutes, I will go to my fourth movement, which is a very interesting and a very disturbing movement that happened in the last 6 months in India, which was a movement led by the dominant social elites. There was a new bill proposed by this government in terms of, it's called the UGC equity regulation, which was giving the SCs, STs, OBCs, that is the lower end marginalized caste, a new instrument to fight discrimination on educational campus. That was the trust that they could go in for complaint, put in complaint in terms of so on and so forth. But the movement that was got onto the streets heavily against the government, and they presented what I would call aggressive victimhood. That they were on the streets arguing that this bill makes the upper caste very vulnerable. Now, again, this I think leads us to very interesting set of questions that how does one analyze, conceptually theorize? Do we have sufficient sociological categories to theorize mass movements or social movements by the dominant social groups? Much of social theory and social movement literature assumes that social movements are led by those on the margins, whether caste, whether it is race, whether it is gender, or whether it is class. But this is a movement that presents us an interesting case where the dominant social elites can also get onto the streets with a performative narrative of what I call aggressive victimhood. That they are aggressive for being dominant social sections. They have large amount of cultural capital. They have large amount of social capital, because of which there was a lot of coverage on the media. But this movement was also partly manufactured by the existing government. Their government had its silent support between. I don't have the details, the time to get into the details of this, but nevertheless, I think it leads us a very interesting question in post-colonial societies. How do we theorize the question of those elites who are socially dominant but economically vulnerable? Much of we don't have data on this. I'm finishing, last one line, that the data on this, but dominant social groups, while on caste front they are dominant, economically many of them are still vulnerable. So how do you then theorize the political subjectivity of such groups?
Thank you very much, Ajay, and thanks for this overview of what has been happening in India over the last few years. I'm sure there will be many questions later on. But I will now move eastwards to Bangladesh and invite Dina to join us with her remarks. 15 minutes also for you, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I may not even need 15 minutes, but do feel free, if I do feel free to interrupt rudely the first time because I tend not to notice. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. This is a really, you've put together a really fascinating set of presentations. Those were really amazing remarks just before me. I have a very different kind of presentation, which is a set of reflections. And coming from, I am an anthropologist, and I'm really looking at trying to understand what happened in Bangladesh in July and August of 24, and from the perspective of 2 years later and what's happening. So these are kind of reflections rather than questions, but hopefully there are questions embedded in what I'm trying to look at. The paper originally was called Naming the Unthinkable, and I want to begin with the idea of the unthinkable, which the toppling of the Awami League government in August 24 was unthinkable, really unimaginable. And I was there at the time until it happened. And it was this amazing moment of rupture. It disrupted all kinds of ideas and theories of, authoritarianism and how rules last and how you can disrupt authoritarianism. But at that point, anything seemed possible. That was a moment of hope until very soon afterwards we had tumultuous, unpredictable, and often a very violent 18 months that followed. And one could sense a palpable shift in the public mood. So it went from hope to despair very, very quickly, particularly because of this kind of visceral fear and panic with the murders of, you won't know these particular characters, but they were burning down, media houses were burnt down. There was a lynching of a garment worker who was a minority person, worker. There was a murder of a prominent kind of Islamist figure. All of this was happening in the shadow of rule that nobody wanted, the so-called Islamist rule. So the disappointment at the revolution gave way to what people thought of as mob violence, hate speech inciting violence. And the figure of the Chhatro Janata, the Chatro is, in most, South Asian languages, the student, and the Janata is the people. And that's something that was used a lot during the uprising. And that represented secular aspirations were in danger of being eclipsed by a newer configuration of the Tawhidi Janata, which was a more Islamized, a stand-in for all manner of Islamic threats. So operating in public spaces, presenting, policing un-Islamic values, targeting the policing of un-Islamic values, all of that was going on. And you can see that. And what you have today, at some level, you could see a standoff between a subdued Chhatro Janata and the Tawhidi Janata. And it very much recalls a pre-Hasina, pre-uprising battle line, and an irresolution of national identity. And I put all of that there because I want to suggest that the ideologies and the multiplicity of ideologies underpinning the uprising went way beyond this binary. They were of a different nature altogether. And this was a moment, and I think going back to that moment allows us for thinking otherwise about other kinds of possibilities, because what the uprising did was it called out the ethno-nationalist, Muslim, and highly militarized state. It offered a possibility for a different kind of imagination of citizenship. And it took on, I think part of, going off on the earlier presentation, it showed the problem to be not just something like secularism isn't there or the Islamists are coming and this fear of Islam, but a much deeper problem with the idea of the nation state. Because the nation state and the people seem to be always produced, and produced as an ethno people. You have the Bengali speaking peoples, and then you have the others. And I will go into this because I think we missed a moment in Bangladesh, and I think we can go back to revisit that moment. I'm going to go back to a moment, we revolt simply because for many reasons we can no longer breathe. That's a line from Fanon. I forgot to turn on my timer, excuse me. That line from Frantz Fanon briefly made the rounds in progressive circles in the days immediately following the unexpected demise of the government of Sheikh Hasina. Fanon's powerful words could not have been more apt, for they call attention to conditions of ruling that had turned everyday life into a form of metaphorical suffocation, even as they gesture to the limits of such conditions. We still need to account for how, in the space of just 20 days, those living with the slow, suffocating violence of a vengeful surveillance state found it impossible to carry on with the status quo, necessary to revolt in order to breathe, and by extension, how university students turned a standard movement for the reallocation of government quotas into a full-fledged people's revolution. In those 3 weeks, the word atonko or terror and kob, resentment, cropped up regularly in conversations around me. I began to conceptualize atonko as an extension and magnification of the fear and uncertainty that ordinary citizens routinely experienced in their exchanges with what had essentially become a police state, in which the consequences of real or imagined political dissent were clear. Harassment, intimidation, the likelihood of being disappeared into the infamous Ainaghar, or even death in an extrajudicial encounter. The question then is, when protesters shouted, Hasina must go, did they all imagine the same future after Hasina? To what extent did the futures imagined by male public university students bear resemblance to their female counterparts? Where did they differ? And as well to garment workers or CNG drivers, which are these tuk-tuk-like things, who spilled into the streets, or without whose presence, in Dhaka on August 5th, the toppling would never have happened. These are both empirical and rhetorical questions, and they urge us to get away from nationalist framings to a larger global framings of what happened, to understand what happened, and to ask us, what if we put the July uprising in a global frame, not even in a South Asian frame? If we take the aspirations and frustrations of Bangladeshi students, not as unique, but shared by young people across the globe at a particular moment. These sentiments, if we understand such sentiments to be shaped by conditions of global imperialist, capitalist, and patriarchal systems, working in tandem with national economies and local political forces. And here is where I would say, and I'd agree, and perhaps many people have said, the anti-discrimination movement which the students had. I mean, they went from demanding quotas, right? And then they made a larger demand which said, we want anti-discrimination. It contained a classically liberal set of demands. Equality of opportunity within the existing capitalist system, with high levels of inequality and very bleak futures, like this generation everywhere else. Students, who were the students? Many of these were students in public universities. They were the children of rickshawalas and garment workers who were beginning to come up, working class, lower middle class, getting into finally university, but also realizing they had absolutely no hope in the future. They wanted to imagine. I think they were in a place where they couldn't even begin to imagine a world in which they could have a viable future. Jobs, aspiration, mobility, a fair shot to obtain a seat at the table. Hardly a call for redistribution or systemic change. And this is where I wouldn't call this a non-ideological movement. This the student movement. It's an ideology that's trapped in neoliberalism, but in also this discourse of development, in which progress is measured through. You had Nusrat Chaudhry earlier, and she's written a lot about infrastructural populism and things. But I think the imaginations of the youth in Bangladesh seem to be so trapped, both in neoliberalism, but in this idea of we have to, we have to build the nation through a certain kind of development. And there is, the imaginations are in Bangladesh are constantly being disciplined by very strong and naturalized development discourses. And that is where I think part of the trap was. And that is part of why this is the students, but I'm going to move to elsewhere. This is where the students entered. But maybe the events of August 5th did not produce anything like an absolute rupture and was doomed to some extent to repetition rather than rupture. I'm going to come back to this because I think I already, I'm halfway through. I want to say in my reading, the uprising itself was an intifada in the most literal sense of this Arabic word, a shaking off or an attempt of all that was associated with the time of Hasina. So despite vast differences within and between students and the people, the Chhatra Janata, the uprising represented a historical refusal both of Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League's authoritarian terrorizing rule and of the grip of an increasingly weaponized nationalist story and nationalist time. This refusal was shown most clearly in the insistence on stretching calendrical time to July 36, to the rejection of August as a sacred month, and in the lyrics of several rap songs that pointed to 1952 rather than 1971 as a foundational historical moment. And I think here is again where there's a real space for possibility for opening up a different way of thinking of the nation, not as an ethno-nationalist nation, and I'll come back to that. But what Hasina did, as we know, drawing on her personal history, which was also national history, Hasina put in place a set of laws that allowed her party to police the lines between loyal and disloyal citizens, blurring the lines between political, economic, and intellectual dissent. And I call this secular blasphemy. Basically, oh my God, 2 minutes. How did that happen? That's not good. Okay, so what happened? But unfortunately, and what the students did was they refused this nationalist time, right? And they had no attachment to 71, and they were trying to find a different kind of nationalist time, which is why they went back to 52. But nationalist refusal is not epistemic rupture. They could not rupture the idea of what the nation imagined, but there were moments, and I don't have slides this time because many of the placards and slogans that we saw in the protest really challenged the ethno-nationalist state, right? So there was one, for instance, from the plains to the hills, the freedom this time is for everyone. And you had different versions of this. And this was a stark reminder, as I say, that the 1971 war had been fought in the name of an ethno-nationalist Bengali majoritarianism and non-Bengali speakers, regardless of religion, were by definition second-class citizens. The chant was a reminder to Bengalis that long before the current Hasina regime, atonko or terror was an everyday experience for those in the Chittagong hill tracts. Another prominent, and I'll finish here, placard contained the following quote from Kolpona Chakma, the outspoken Adivashi activist who was disappeared by the army in 1996. Everything that is experimented on the hills will be implemented on the plains. And you can see this division in everybody's imagination. These are prescient words from a promising feminist who is still officially missing. I don't know if Kalpana ever read Aimé Césaire, but her embodied experience of settler colonialism might have prompted her to assume that the violence of the Bengali ethno-state would come back to haunt those who had most benefited from settler colonialism in CHT. So I think now there are, and I haven't gone into the naming part at all, but the way in which we remember July, the different names for it, either shut down new kinds of imagination of citizenship or can open up what was wrong with the Bengali nationalist Muslim majoritarian ethno-state to begin with. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. And we now move to Nepal for our last talk, and then we will have a time for Q&A. So please, those of you in the audience, if you want to ask a question to the speakers, just put them in the Q&A box within Zoom, and I will consolidate them and bring them forward for discussion. Please do that. So we know, sorry, Santosh, I would leave the floor to you, if that is all right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Chair Diego, distinguished panelists, participating members. First of all, I'd like to thank ISAS and US for organizing this timely seminar. Now, today I'll talk about Nepal's Gen Z movement on the title of New Hopes but Old Challenges. Now, before that, I'd also like to acknowledge the research conducted by Nepal Institute for Policy Research with support from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Nepal. This presentation is substantially informed by that research, including national survey data of youth perceptions. Now, my presentation is structured into 4 parts. First, what happened? Second, why did it happen? Third, what was the role of ideology? And fourth, what are the challenges going forward? Now, my central argument for today's presentation is that Nepal's Gen Z movement emerged from a long-standing frustration over corruption and economic stagnation, and was articulated through a thin ideological framework where valence-based concerns of anti-corruption and good governance substituted for traditional political, social, or economic ideologies. Now, what happened? On 8 September 2025, thousands of young people gathered at Maitigar Mandala in Kathmandu, Nepal's central protest site, located near the administrative center and the federal parliament. Now, the protest was mobilized online by loosely connected youth networks, initially in response to the government's attempt to regulate social media platform, which ultimately led to the ban of social media in early September. The state underestimated the mobilization. By midday, the protest had swelled and marched towards the parliament, breaching security barricades. When protesters attempted to enter the premises of the parliament building, security forces opened fire, killing 19 youths on the first day. This triggered a nationwide escalation. Within 36 hours, protests spread across the country, key state institutions were attacked, and political elites became direct targets of public anger. The violence resulted in over 70 deaths and economic losses exceeding USD 600 million, which is about 1.3% of Nepal's GDP. The government, led by KP Sharma Oli, collapsed despite commanding a parliamentary majority. The Home Minister resigned on the first day itself, and the next day, the Prime Minister followed under intense political pressure. Subsequently, after engagement between protest groups and the president, parliament was dissolved. Former Chief Justice Susila Karki was appointed Prime Minister with a mandate to hold elections on 5th March 2026. That election produced a dramatic political shift. A relatively new political force, barely 4 years old, secured a near two-third majority, and its senior leader, Balendra Shah, is said to be the next Prime Minister. In short, the government with a strong legal footing collapsed in less than 2 days, revealing a profound gap between electoral authority and political legitimacy. Now, why did it happen? The immediate trigger was the government's attempt to regulate social media, which again ultimately led to the ban of 26 social media platforms. However, the underlying causes are structural and long-term. First, the economic stagnation and lack of opportunity. Since the democratic transition of Nepal in 1990, Nepal's average growth rate has remained modest at around 4% with limited job creation. As a result, labor migration has become a structural feature of the economy. Approximately 3,000 Nepalese leave the country daily for employment or education abroad, and remittances account for roughly a quarter of GDP. This has created a paradox: macroeconomic stability without domestic opportunity. Second, endemic corruption and government's failure. Political elites and their network have captured state institutions, generating widespread perceptions of rent-seeking and impunity. Corruption scandals have become routine, and the expansion of social media has only amplified their visibility. Third, the chronic political instability. Since the 1990s, governments in Nepal have been short-lived with an average tenure of just over a year. Frequent leadership changes and coalition bargaining have fostered the perception of politics as a self-serving and disconnected from public needs. Fourth, a gradual buildup of youth frustration. Over the past several years, youth-led campaigns, both online and offline, have expressed dissatisfaction with corruption, lack of opportunity, and elite privilege. The rise of anti-establishment sentiments were already evident in earlier political outcomes, including the emergence of new political actors. These conditions created a reservoir of discontent. The social media restriction acted as the catalyst, not the cause. It directly affected the primary space through which young people communicate, organize, and express dissent. Once mobilized, the digital networks enabled rapid escalation without the need for formal organizational structures. Now, this brings us to the central analytical question: what role did ideology play? Nepal's Gen Z movement is best understood as a case of thin ideology or even a post-ideological movement. First, the movement was diagnostic rather than programmatic. It clearly identified systemic problems, that is, corruption, governance failure, lack of opportunity, but did not converge around a coherent policy agenda or ideological blueprint for reform. Second, it was framed around valence issues. In political science, valence issues are those that command broad agreement across society, such as anti-corruption and good governance. They differ from positional issues which divide actors along ideological lines. In this case, in Nepal's Gen Z movement case, anti-corruption functioned as the unifying frame across class, age, and partisan identities. This enabled rapid mobilization but limited ideological depth. Third, the movement was organizationally decentralized with diffused leadership. It was not led by political parties or ideological leaders, but by loosely connected youth networks, primarily urban and digitally engaged. This horizontal structure enhanced inclusivity and speed, but constrained coherence and long-term strategic direction. Fourth, there is a notable degree of ideological indifference among the participants. Many Gen Z activists do not strongly identify with traditional left-right distinctions along political, economic, or social axes. Instead, they view establishment parties, regardless of ideological orientation, as equally responsible for corruption and government failure. Finally, the movement highlights a distinction between democratic participation and political legitimacy. Nepali youth have not rejected democracy. On the contrary, their engagement in protest and subsequent elections indicate commitment to strong democratic processes. Additionally, the movement was not anti-elite. It is what is the case in many other countries. It is specifically anti-political elite. In fact, many newly elected MPs, member of parliaments, are professionals in their respective field. However, procedural legitimacy being elected is no longer sufficient. Performance legitimacy, delivering good governance, accountability, and results have now become the key. This aligns with broader discussions in comparative politics. When democratic systems fail to deliver outcomes, legitimacy shifts from procedures to performance. Now, the movement has delivered rapid political change. The election, too, has delivered the change in party and personnel. Whether it can deliver structural transformation remains uncertain. Now, anti-corruption reform is inherently long-term, as Lee Kuan Yew had argued, addressing systemic corruption requires sustained political will, institutional reform, and often politically costly decisions. It is not a short-term project. However, the expectations of Gen Z are immediate. This creates a significant gap between public demand and institutional capacity. Second, governing is fundamentally different from protesting. Setting an agenda on the street is not the same as implementing it through bureaucratic and political system. Many newly elected representatives lack experience in governance, which may affect policy execution. Then there is a recurring historical pattern in Nepal: political transformation without any structural transformation. Changes in leadership or regime have not consistently translated into improvements in governance or economic performance. The institutional and administrative structure that existed still largely remains unchanged. And then there is the risk of cyclical disillusionment. If the new political leadership fails to deliver tangible improvements, public trust may erode further, potentially intensifying future instability. In that sense, Nepal's Gen Z movement represents both continuity and change. It is part of a long tradition of youth-led political mobilization that has periodically shaped Nepal's political landscape. At the same time, it differs in its mode of organization: digitally networked, decentralized, and ideologically thin. The movement has successfully altered the political order with remarkable speed. It has replaced established actors with new ones and redefined the terms of political legitimacy. Yet, the underlying challenges remain unchanged: economic stagnation, institutional weakness, and entrenched corruption. If the new government can translate this movement into sustained improvements in governance and economic opportunity, it may mark a genuine turning point in Nepal's political trajectory. If not, this movement risks being another episode in recurring cycle where political upheaval generates high expectations but limited long-term transformation. The hopes are high, the actors are new, and the mandate is strong, but the constraints are also deeply embedded. Whether this moment becomes a turning point or a repetition will depend now not on mobilization, but on governance. Now I'll stop here for the time being, and if we have any questions, then happy to answer during the Q&A. Thank you, Diego.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Santosh. Also for saving a few minutes. Let me, where has the, oh, there it is. Okay, I will invite once again those in the audience to put questions in the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I will ask myself a few questions to the three members of the audience, as well as perhaps offer some food for thoughts, which was stimulated by our speakers. Well, first of all, I would like to say something rather obvious, which is that India seems to be a very different case from the other two, and also if we added Sri Lanka into the picture, so my impression is that it would be grouped with Nepal and Bangladesh rather than with India. And that is, of course, begs the questions as to why protests in India have been of a very different nature. One could speculate. One thing could be that despite everything, the BJP government remains popular. a lot more popular than the triad governments. That could be one option, number one. Another option could be that India's democratic institutions, despite the fact that they've been severely eroded over the last decade, they are stronger and they have a longer history, so to speak, and this gives space to protest movements to find institutional channels to channel that protest. Is the classical political science argument that institutionalization helps channeling protest movements and helps the stability of the system. So I would like to hear from the three of you, first of all, your ideas of as to why do you think the India case is different, if it is different from your own. But then I also have some more specific questions for the three of you. The first one is for Ajay, which ended his presentation with a very interesting question of the how do we theorize about the protest of the dominant groups or of the elites. And well, this is something that it's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it's not an isolated example. India, in this case, we can think of white people protesting in the US, for example, that they are the dominant group, and yet they feel they need to protest, change the system, and even with a little bit of a stretch, attack the capital because they have to take back their countries or something like that. So that is interesting. But I wanted to push you a little bit that also the Gen Z movement about mining and the environment can be seen as an elite movement. And also the farmer protest can be seen as an elite movement. These were the upper strata of the farmers. Perhaps, so not an elite in the sense in which the protest against the UGC regulations were, but nevertheless, some privileged group in society that took to the street. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that. For Dina, much of your talk made me think about the students' protest or the youth protest in the 60s and 70s in Europe and in the US. Um, and you said that the ideology of the Bangladeshi movements was mainly in terms of the differences there were with that protest movements. Um, in the 60s and 70s in Europe and the US, the youth had lots of opportunities, had lots of jobs. So the economy was booming, and all of them could clearly see a very economically stable future ahead of them. And that is perhaps why they resorted to ideology. The movements were deeply ideological, so they were protesting against the Vietnam War or capitalism or whatever it was, or also on the right side. They were. In Italy, in my country especially, they were trying to overthrow the government because they were fearing being subject to the Soviet Union. So how do we, put all of this, this difference together, and what can we learn from how protest, which erupted at a very similar point of the age of a country, if you like. If by age of a country you mean the demographic age, so the moment in which a lot of young people happens to be on the planet and in the same country at the same time. So this somewhat naturally brings more creative energy, let's call it that. But then it takes very different forms. I would like to hear your thoughts on that. And Santosh, your presentation made me think that to other protest movements which are actually happening in the West in very recent years in terms of how they are diagnostics, to use your term, and they focus on things that everybody agrees upon. No corruption, or well, that is a big one. Or the political elites are a caste on their own, and they only think about their privileges and so on. Um, so, which is directly connected to populism, right? So, what do you? But in the case of Nepal, would you see the movement that brought down the government and what has emerged ever since as something akin to populist movements, in the sense that they are anti-elite, even if they are anti-political elites, as part of the populist movement. I will stop here, and then we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I would give you the time to answer to the first remarks, and then we take it forward. Thank you. And if we could respond perhaps in the order of the presentation, so I would start with Ajay, then Dina, and then Santosh.
Okay. Thank you, Diego, for those really wonderful and difficult questions. On the first point that you made in terms of Indian exceptionalism, is there an Indian exceptionalism? I think is a good question to pursue. And the points that really come to my mind is that India is a large nation, and territorially and culturally very, very diverse, in terms of political economy too, in terms of land patterns, rural, urban distinctions. I think, again, India is vastly more complex and diversified than other nations. So that comes as one. The second important reason that comes to my mind is this regime's grip over cultural politics and cultural narratives, the way they could touch cultural codes and civilizational narratives, memory, the way they could invoke some of these, what I would call in cultural sociology, they would refer to as symbolic power. That's not merely the material and the physical aspect, but the symbolic power that this regime could generate continues to dictate the dominant narrative and continues to provide the dominant perspective for much of the citizenry to reflect on. And oppositional parties, for various complex reasons, have not yet, in spite of the fact that it's been 12 years, that they've not been able to really produce a strong and an effective counter narrative. I mean, there have been narratives of constitutionalism, there have been narratives of caste census, social justice, but those narratives have failed to displace this pan-Indian kind of. This is what is very interesting, that while Indian citizenry, I would call, essentially have a regional and a very provincial imagination, that this regime for the first time perhaps presents a kind of a pan-Indian cultural and a civilizational narrative, which is resonating very well with the citizens on the ground. So that would be my provisional answer as to what could possibly explain this Indian exceptionalism, as to why we did not have the kind of mass Gen Z protests that Nepal and Bangladesh witnessed, and India, it still eludes India. On the second part, in terms of your argument of protest by the elites, that you made a very interesting comparison with the white working class in, let's say, in the Rust Belt area, which effectively supported Trump and brought back Trump. You have similar examples in Brazil, where you have had parallel movements with no against corruption and nationalism. You have the Tea Party thing, which Tara Scotch-Paul reflects upon. I think, but my central question still remains that what is it that it informs us in terms of our social theory? That what are the new social categories that we need to really invent in terms of theorizing this entire thing? Because social theory partly, slants for the understandable reasons in terms of theorizing from the margins. But when you have similar protest forms, similar expression of vulnerabilities, similar anxieties about marginalization, similar anxieties about stigma, then, I mean, our discourse really turns on its head. That we thought that these categories ideally explain those at the margins, but these are the same categories which the dominant groups are adopting to kind of express their experiences. So what happens to those categories when they get contaminated by social elites. And third, you made again very important point that even farmers movement was a rich farmers movement, which you are right. Gen Z was also a middle class movement. So by and large, I would argue, post-colonial theorist Partha Chatterjee in the Indian context made this distinction between civil society and political society. That civil society is a rights-bearing citizen where upper middle classes, professional, English-speaking elites reside, while the margins don't speak the language of rights, but they speak the language of contextual negotiation. I mean, that partly gives us an entry point to theorize as to why it is the protest has become a site of privilege in post-colonial society. That this is a dominant privileged groups today in whatever sense, whether it's caste, whether it's class, whether it's urban habitation. It is those groups and rich peasantry in the rural hinterlands, which is these groups which continue to fit our conventional canonical imagination of protest politics. While the subaltern groups, whether on the caste or the urban poor or the landless, have seemed to move away to a more contextual negotiation. They are more involved in the electoral democratic processes. They are more involved in negotiating the state to get populist SOPs. So things have really changed in a very dramatic sense. So this again throws up really, I think, hard questions for us, for political theorists to really question as to how do we see this shift, that protests by the privileged and negotiations by the marginalized, that we do not have that, in your initial remarks, you talked about revolutionary change. That revolution, when revolution itself becomes the import of the elite imagination, of the imagination of the privileged. And in India, this discourse is there in the public domain, that it is the elites who can afford. Even in my surveys, when I visited the Haryana where the farmers' protest happened, people asked me this question. I was confronted with this question. Tell me who can sit on a protest for 2 years? Those with money and time. Everyday people are with hard lives. They have to earn their everyday living. So protests, our liberal, even civil disobedient forms of protest, I think assumed certain social privilege is inbuilt to it. I think today that other forms of negotiation are coming to the front, but we need sufficient social and political theory to kind of theorize how should we look at protest itself. Is it politics of the possible? Is it contextual negotiation? But then we are confronted with these traditional questions. There's no structural change. There are no big questions being asked. The big ticket questions are missing. Ideology is missing. Long-term vision is missing. So how do we then theorize? Obviously, we can't take a moral take on the subaltern politics. But how do we then confuse and conjoin the subaltern everyday protest forms, everyday contextual negotiations with larger social questions?
Thank you, Ajay, for your thoughtful response. Dina, over to you.
Thank you. Just very briefly, on the India question, I'd actually say India and Pakistan are both very interesting to think with in relation to the smaller states of Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And I would say perhaps they had something to do with size. But it's worth thinking about why in Pakistan as well, which has had many, many movements, quite important movements, of which the names I will not remember, but certainly in the Northwest frontier provinces and other places, there are very serious movements, sometimes youth-led, but that are constantly being smashed by the military. And I will say in India, I don't know, I think size matters. But I also, if you think about Kashmir, which Kashmiris wouldn't say is in India, but again, any youth protests have been, I think we have to also bring in the margins of the so-called margins as well when we're thinking about why revolution or uprisings happen and when they don't and when they get visibility and when they don't. And I think having visibility also makes a huge difference in these things. So that's my, very quick question to that. Yes, thinking about the 1960s, I hadn't really thought about it. One thing I'll say is I don't want to fetishize the youth. This Gen Z thing has become a little bit like, oh, there's something magical about the youth and only the youth can bring about change. I really want to push back against that. But it is true that younger people, are generally much more free in to imagine to not be so worried about their futures, and therefore they go out into the streets. I think the difference between And I think there is something about the moment who went out, when. And I'm thinking in the 60s, also the Nakshalites in India who went out in Kolkata, they were also very middle class, Bhadro, the kind of people who could afford to be there, and their counterparts are the ones that you are talking about in the late 1960s. In a sense, in the US. In the US, there was a little bit of a difference because people had, young men had to deal with the draft, so they had a real stake in avoiding the war. But I think the well-offness and the futureness is something that gave people, you could read Foucault and do a critique of liberalism and go out on the streets. We're talking about a very different moment now, absolutely different, where I think futures for everybody are so much more bleak than they were. And I think the analytic to think with is sort of the globality of certain moments, right? The 60s, I don't think, we can think about the US versus Bangladesh. To me, that's not particularly useful. It's that in that global moment, there was so much possibility for hope everywhere. We are in a moment of despair. I mean, that's why I'm thinking about hope and despair. And that despair is global and it gets more despairing. So it's a different reason. And I think in Bangladesh, the better off students in the private universities joined as solidarity the movement, but it wasn't really their movement originally. And in Bangladesh, certainly this was not an elite movement initially. This was movement because most of the elite students in private universities didn't really care about this quota. They would have looked down on these government jobs that these, more subaltern type students wanted. So I'm really thinking in terms of globality as an analytic to try and understand what's going on. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dina. Santosh.
Thank you. I think going back to India, I think there was one important movement in India, I think in 2014, if I'm correct, regarding the Lokpal bill, which was about accountability. And I think it was a precursor, though it was not led by the youth, but it was a precursor of how other movements in South Asia would come up, especially vis-a-vis accountability and corruption. So in that sense, I think, but however, I think India had fairly strong institutions to start with compared to what Bangladesh and Nepal had, whereby most of the state institutions are hollowed out by politicization. Therefore, these were much weaker to start with to hold any weight. And hence, probably things did not change to the extent in India as it did in Nepal or Bangladesh. So coming to your question on populism, for sure, it was a populist movement. However, it had some very distinctive characters in Nepal, especially unlike in Europe, for example, where the populist narrative builds around anti-immigration, for instance, or sometimes on religion or identity itself. This movement was none of those. In fact, this movement, I think, brought together different ethnicities, which were earlier the basis for nationalism. The ethnic nationalism had increased in Nepal. The effective mode of nationalism in Nepal was ethnic since the late 1990s to the early parts of the mid 2010s and so forth. And this movement, I think, went beyond that ethnic narrative as well. So in that sense, it was not against any particular ethnicity for causing the problem. At the same time, it was also not a movement, but it was a populist movement, but not one against all the elites. For example, especially when we see in Western Europe or in the US, the distrust of the professionals elites has been quite high, especially among the populist movements. But I think that trust in Nepal, I think the trust on technocracy actually is the central point, that the political leadership did not deliver. Therefore, we need a more technocratic sort of elite to rule over. So in that sense, it differs. And this populist movement also differs from the previous populist movement in Nepal itself. Earlier, oftentimes, whenever it was a populist movement, it was oftentimes anti-Indian to start with. I think that was the rallying cry for a lot of political parties to bring in that populist nationalist narrative. And more importantly, I think this populist narrative did not have a populist leader to start with, which is oftentimes the marker that things coalesce around a populist leader and their ideologies. But this one was effectively leaderless and centered around anti-political elite because they were seen as the symbol of corruption rather than for being political elite by themselves. So that was why this was populist movement, but not in the way traditional populist movements occur.
Thank you, Santosh. Let me just add a quick thought on what you started with the Lokpal bill in India. So I think that there is a key difference there. That the Lokpal bill movement in India was a lot more top down and imposed from the top and the right of the system than the movements in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal ever were. And they were very leader centric, which is another key difference. But yes, I take your point. Okay, so we have three questions from the audience. I think our speakers are able to see them in the Q&A box, but I will read them out loud anyway for the audience. The first one is from Harindra Dasanayake. The question is from Nepal to Bangladesh to Sri Lanka, so I guess it's for the three of you. Since elections are now being held and new governments have been formed, how can we now take stocks of what has been the potential of the respective countries to take a new path vis-a-vis the kind of electoral compromise that is being made? Rajni, if you want to jump in on Sri Lanka, please feel free. A second question is for you, Santosh, by Yagdeep Airi. That's what it says. And there was a lot of debate about the return of the monarchy in Nepal. Do you think the results of the March election is referendum on it? And finally, a question again, a general question by Sandeep Bhardwaj, sorry. The systems in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were able to absorb the protests relatively quickly compared to, say, Arab Spring. All three have managed to quickly achieve stability and even hold elections. Is this because, despite all its weaknesses, these countries have a democratic kernel that is resilient, or because the system is capable of quickly co-opting and neutralizing public dissatisfaction, or some other reasons? Perhaps we now go in reverse order. If Santosh, you are happy with that?
Sure, Diego. I think let me take that second question first, and then I think I'll also toss on the first and third questions right up there. I think the short answer to the second question is no, it's not. It's not a referendum on monarchy. In fact, when we conducted the youth survey, I think monarchy was one of the least favored institutional changes that the youth were looking for. So there are way fewer people supporting monarchy today, especially among the youths themselves. Therefore, this movement now is not either for or even against monarchy per se. So this had a very different issue, which was not related to monarchy. But this could, I think, open the way for some supporters of monarchy, in the sense that some youth groups that participated in the protest had getting monarchy is one of their goals, but largely it's a fairly unpopular proposition among most of the youths, and my political experience suggests probably among the larger mass as well. Having said that, there seems to be a little bit more enthusiasm for the against the secularist sentiments. So well, the mood yet is not to have a Hindu state, but there have been some backlash against the form of secularism that we have practiced since 2006. So in that sense, I think there is a lot. But having said that, this movement was largely apart from the contest or even a referendum on monarchy. Now, on this third question specifically, I think even we were also quite surprised that within a matter of 6 months, Nepal was able to move from a movement, a new government, a new election, and I think imminently, I think within the next couple of days, we will have a new form of government. And this happened largely without much violence. Having said that, I think more than 70 people died on the day of movement, on the 2 days of movement. So it's not nothing, but largely since then, it has been a violence-free movement. And the election happened fairly. And in no places were there any accusations of election meddling. So in that sense, I think we have achieved that. This shows the trust that Nepalese put on the electoral process. But like I said earlier, now that is not sufficient. I think just winning elections is not sufficient. The legitimacy of the next government will derive. Now they have a responsibility to perform, and their legitimacy will be derived from their performance rather than the electoral process alone. So had electoral process alone been sufficient, the earlier government was almost a two-third majority government, putting in the two coalitions together. It was almost a two-third government with almost two-thirds support. Therefore, the next issue is going to be performance. And I think largely, at least in context of Nepal, I think the new political party, Rashtriya Swatantra Party, it has won almost two-third majority. So they have a big opportunity. I think in the last, since 2006, the elections in 2006, we never had a majority government, a single party gaining majority. So there were different coalitions by force. So the political parties did not have a choice. The new party that's soon to come to power, the Rashtriya Swatantra Party, has won almost two-third majority. They still don't have that number in the upper house, which is also relevant in terms of lawmaking. Therefore, they won't be able to change everything to their wishes, but that shows the big political mandate that they have, and I think that also gives them a big responsibility at the same time. Having said that, I think if they try to railroad through all the changes by themselves, I think it will probably backfire. So a better way would be to even engage the rest of the political stakeholders who are weak now, but still, I think that would give a sense of national unity towards a common goal, rather than having to go alone, which could create tensions among the political parties in near future. So they don't need to, but I think it would be we would have a greater political stability if they also take into consideration the smaller political actors, which were the former establishment parties. I think let me stop there.
Thank you, Santosh. Dina, you want to add something on the questions from the audience?
I'll add something to the first and third questions very quickly. On the taking stock in new paths, it's interesting, the student party, the NCP in Bangladesh, right before the elections, did something quite, that was, again, in a sense, you could say unthinkable until it happened. They announced an electoral alliance with the Jamaat-e-Islami, which was seen as very anti-nationalist, whatever. It was very counterintuitive, but in a sense, they were trapped, to get to the question, the electoral compromises that have been made. This was an electoral compromise made so that they could actually stay in the scene and be an actor, because it was very obvious they were not going to get any seats. And they very willingly did that. And I think it undercut so much of their credibility. But that is where we are now because we've gone from the moment of uprising slash revolution and hope into we've got to get in there into the seats of power. And that's been very, very disappointing. In relation to the Arab Spring, perhaps there's something. I think one thing I will say about the countries in the Arab Spring, we have to talk about imperialism and US interests and other European interests. So Egypt, Tunisia, all of these places, they were, there was a lot of external influence in what happened with the Arab Spring once with the kind of revolutions that they had, which fortunately we don't have, for instance, in Bangladesh. There is some investment, geopolitical investment more and more in Bangladesh, but it isn't there. I think the system can really co-opt. I think that is very true. The neoliberal system and the electoral system can constantly co-opt grievances. And finding this language of counter narratives, it seems to me, is so important that are not so easy to be co-opted. And for instance, the anti-Indian counter narrative is so interesting so the anti-Indian narrative in Bangladesh takes genuine grievances over trade, water, all kinds of things, but it slides into communalism or, it slides into other things that's easy to mobilize people through affect. And I think what we haven't been able to do is really, even though I think we are all very grateful that the elections happened. The real, I feel like we might be back to where we were, in a sense, after all of that. So I'll just leave it there.
On this happy note, let me ask Ajay if he wants to add something from the questions were mostly on the other countries, but perhaps you want to add a perspective from India.
Yeah, I mean, I think a more broader point, even drawing from the previous response, that we are living in very paradoxical times, that elections are significant, but elections are also inconsequential. We know that nothing much is going to change even after elections. So I think the even the aspect of globality, I think the neoliberal consensus is really spinning and springing surprising. One is co-option, but also it's, I think, spinning different kind of political subjectivity on the ground. Across spectrum in India for political parties, there is hardly any difference on the economic policy front. They're all talking similar neoliberal infrastructural populism. It's only the difference is on the cultural front. So I think there is very little for people to choose, and this is making political subjectivity very, very paradoxical. People are very angry with neoliberalism, but then they go back and vote very pro-corporate governments. So this, I think, is this paradoxical thing. There is growing inequalities after neoliberalism, but we see sustained terminal decline of left politics and social democratic imagination on the ground. So I think we need to really find a way to break this kind of a vicious cycle as to what people have been pushed to, and see that where those alternatives would really imagine. As of now, we really do not have that alternative clear in mind, because any big ticket change is something people simply don't seem to be convinced. It looks fairly abstract, therefore it looks principled, therefore it looks privileged. I think that is the bottleneck we need to really break.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ajay. And thank you, all of you. We are running out of time, so let me thank you once again for joining us. And I would invite you to rejoin tomorrow at, let me see if I can get this right, 9 a.m., I think, Singapore time, for day 2 of the ISAS International Conference 2026. We have 3 other panels that cover more ground on the protests that have been characterizing much of South Asia over the last few years, including Sri Lanka, about which we haven't talked much today. So stay tuned, and thank you again to all of you. Bye bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Digger.
you. Thank you, Tanuja and Rajni, too. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.